Hello, everyone. We are here for the webinar Blended Finance and Local Entrepreneurship, the Key to WASH Investments. Your host, as usual, is Samuel Baumgartner. And today we have Paul Hailey here, our Head of Sustainability and Impact. Just a reminder, you're all muted, of course. So if you have a question, please type it into the side box and we will get to it at the end. And a little bit about responsAbility. We are a sustainable investment house that specializes in impact investing in emerging markets. We invest in financial inclusion, such as microfinance or fintech, in sustainable food and agriculture across the entire value chain, and of course, climate finance from green lending to net zero strategies. So over to you, Samuel and Paul, and I will jump back in at the end for the questions.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Stacey. A very warm welcome from my side as well to all attendees. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. It's great to have you on board. Also, a very warm welcome to you, Paul. Great to have you on this session. Paul, you're our head of impact at responsAbility. Maybe to put this in a little bit of context for our attendees, could you give us an insight of what you're currently working on and what's keeping you busy?
Sure. Well, look, I mean, one example of something I'm working on right now is trying to gather the impact data that we get from the companies that we finance, whether that be in the agricultural space or in the microfinance space or in the renewable energy space. Now, this isn't like clicking a button on a Bloomberg and getting the ESG data popping up. This is an exercise that requires us to really think about the metrics that we want from these companies that demonstrates their impact. It involves us reaching out to these organizations wherever they are in the 70 odd different countries where we invest, trying to get the information back and going through it and looking at it and trying to work out, well, you know, what does this tell us about the way that they're having an impact in their communities?
You make obviously looking at impact components on a daily basis and part of your core activities. Could you maybe for those investors, for those attendees who are new to these sessions, also just give a very quick summary of how we go about to define impact and impact investing?
Sure. It's a good question to start with because, I mean, these days, as you know, and as I'm sure anyone who's on this webinar knows, that everyone is talking about sustainable investing or ESG or impact investing. The thing is, though, I mean, impact investing is a lot like dancing. Okay, a lot of people think they're great at it, but when they get on the dance floor, you see some people who look good, but also a lot of people who look horribly out of their depth. This is a metaphor that's close to my heart, obviously. Proper impact investing means that, first of all, you come up with a kind of an impact thesis, if that doesn't sound a bit pretentious, where you say, first of all, you say, how are you going to use your money to make a positive contribution, to create jobs, to provide essential services, to mitigate climate change? And then you invest your money in a way that tangibly contributes, demonstrably contributes to that impact thesis. Now, responsAbility, we only do impact investing, and we focus on private equity and private debt in developing markets, because that's where we think many of the biggest challenges in the world today are, and it's where we want to make a difference.
Wonderful. Before we jump into the title of the webinar, we would also like to pose a question to the audience here, and we would like to know from you how familiar are you with the term WASH? And while we do that, I would also like to clear up with a few or one or two additional terminologies, of which I would like for you, Paul, to define what blended finance stands for and what this is all about, because this will be popping up during the session today, one or the other time.
Sure, okay. Well, look, the official definition of blended finance, and as you could probably tell, I'm reading this here, is the strategic use of development finance for the mobilization of additional finance towards sustainable development in developing countries. So it's not the most snappy of definitions, but what it basically means is it's a blending of money from public sources, such as development finance institutions like the World Bank or Proparco or EBRD, with money from private investors. And it's usually with the aim of catalyzing private investments into areas that otherwise struggle to attract funding, notably in the developing world.
Thank you very much for that. And I think we now also have the results popping up. So we have actually quite a range of people who have a solid idea of what WASH stands for. There's also a group that has been familiarized or has heard about the 4 letters, but we also have quite a group of people who've never heard of it. And for these people, Paul, what do the letters WASH actually stand for? So for those who have maybe a bit of a familiarity with it, but especially those who've never heard of it, so that they also can put it into context, and that would also be the last terminology part that we will clean up today.
Sure. Well, it's the thing about impact investing. Like, I think, like a lot of industries, it's full of acronyms. And so WASH is about water and sanitation and hygiene. And this might sound like maybe not the most obvious or glamorous of topics, but it is an important one. In fact, it has a whole SDG dedicated to it, SDG 6. Why is it important? Well, worldwide, you have 1 in 3 people who do not have access to safe drinking water. You have 2 out of 5 people who don't have a basic hand washing facility with soap and water. Now, I think even before the pandemic, most of us could have said, well, that's obviously a problem. I think in the last couple of years, all of us have learned the value of being able to wash your hands. When you add in the fact, though, that you have 2.4 billion people who don't have access to basic sanitation services, or such as toilets or latrines, then the result you get is actually a very negative one in terms of from a public health perspective. To put that into a bit of context, nearly 1,000 children die every day due to preventable water and sanitation related diarrheal diseases. So this really is a huge public health problem. And it's one also which has consequences beyond the simple question of public health. For example, on a social level, women and girls are responsible for water collection in 80% of households. 80% of households that don't have access to water, obviously. And this has been shown to have a significant impact on their ability to do other things, notably, for example, obtain a decent education. It takes up a lot of time to collect water if you don't have access to it. It's also a problem that is going to get more severe as the effects of climate change become more and more notable. Now, when you have extreme heat waves like the ones that we've seen in the last couple of weeks in India and Pakistan, and when you also have greater levels of salination, for example, which is something that we anticipate as the years come by, this obviously has an impact in terms of increasing water consumption and increasing water consumption and diminishing water supplies. So all of this is to say this is a major problem when it comes to development, and it's a problem which is going to become more significant as time comes by.
So matching with the points that you've just mentioned on how important it is to look at this topic, and considering the fact that one of the core components of impact investing is specifically to address in a measurable way social and environmental developmental components, is this something that's been on the radar for impact investing firms and impact investors, or is this something that's completely new that's now starting to pop up?
No, it is a topic that I think everyone's been aware of, but I think it's only really with blended finance that that we found that we've been able to do more in this space and to have more of an impact on it. So perhaps I could give a couple of examples of the kind of organizations that we financed in this space. To give you one example, there was one company that we financed called Rian Water, which is based in India, and they do small and mid-sized infrastructure in third-tier towns and cities, and also in rural areas. So these are areas that typically don't really have access to water or sanitation, and so the projects that they put in place have helped to connect 1.5 million people to piped water. And our role is to come in and provide them with the financing they need to kind of get these projects up and running. And obviously, they are providing a service that is paid for by the government. Conversely, when you have communities that are perhaps a bit more rural and a little bit more isolated, or where the government simply doesn't have the capacity to provide funding, there is one company that we finance called Jibu, where they are providing clean and safe drinking water in canisters to rural communities in East Africa. And they've facilitated the supply of 78 million litres of drinking water in 2020. Now, these are both examples of what we would call direct investments. That is to say that they are organizations that we are financing that are directly involved in this space. But we also, of course, we use our network of financial institutions. We've been operating in the microfinance space for nearly 20 years now, and we do what's called indirect investments as well. So there we will finance a financial institution which has a part of its portfolio that is dedicated towards this topic or to companies that are in this topic. Again, an example here would be Bina Arthur, which is an Indonesian microfinance institution, most of whose clients are women in rural areas, and they have part of their portfolio that is specifically dedicated towards microloans that are dedicated towards sanitation projects. So I know this sounds like the least glamorous topic in the world, but they are providing microloans for toilets effectively, mostly towards women in rural areas. Now, not only does this provide a benefit in terms of water and in terms of healthcare and quality of life, it also has an improvement in terms of, for example, security. So it's really the kind of project that, yes, it's not the most glamorous topic in the world, but it has a tangible benefit when it comes to quality of life.
Well, and I think you mentioned it earlier when we were working in preparation for this webinar. There's also a range of secondary benefits. I mean, the example with Jibu that you just gave, there's not only a contribution, quite a widespread contribution to access to water, but there's also job creations. There's also additional income for people involved in the value chain, etc. Are there other examples of secondary beneficiaries from this, maybe also on the recipient side?
Yes, well, I mean, a good example beyond, I think the example you gave is a very good one in terms of job creation. And likewise, obviously, any infrastructure project, whether it's just simply building a toilet in a rural area or building a larger infrastructure project like what Rian is doing, that also has benefits in terms of job creation, but it also builds up a certain degree of internal know-how within those countries and within those communities. So at that point, you're also transmitting knowledge and you're transmitting capacity building within those communities, hopefully to the long-term benefit.
We've now looked at the issues that we're addressing when doing investments into WASH topics or into WASH as a topic on its own, and we've also looked at some of the examples of enterprises that receive financing for these. As part of impact investing, the measurability is also a core component of the investment activity. Could you also give us some insights of how we go about this, setting key metrics, of some of the challenges that we have also in collecting the necessary data to measure more the social and I guess in this case mainly the social contribution and developmental factors that we're looking at through the investment activity?
Well, you just heard me talking about how it's a little more complicated than just clicking on a Bloomberg. So you're right to point to this, I'd say. The way that we measure impact for these organizations, obviously it varies a little bit as a function of what exactly they're doing. So if you have, so we would, first of all, we'd look at things like, well, how are they improving the degree of accessibility to water or sanitation? And that you can measure things like, well, what is the number of people that they are reaching? They are creating an infrastructure project that on average is going to reach this many people, or they're providing a specific service that reaches this many people. For those that are providing a specific service, you would also try to look at, well, to what extent is their product affordable, and trying to measure that not just against local income levels, but if there is any kind of competitor out there or some kind of proxy for that, trying to compare that as well, because you want to make sure, of course, that above all you're helping low-income populations, because they're the ones who are most likely to be excluded from access to these services. Finally, for something like the microloans for sanitation, you can also look at the average loan size as a proxy for ensuring, again, that they are really targeting low-income households. If it's a low average loan size, then that hopefully is an indicator that this is the case. You can also look at something like the share of female borrowers. Again, as we mentioned before, women are often particularly discriminated against or particularly tend to particularly suffer from the negative effects of lack of proper water or sanitation facilities. And so if you are really reaching women in rural areas, that really is the population that will really most benefit from your activities and from your investments.
So we've now gotten quite a few glimpses into sort of the investee or the investment side, looking at some of the examples of what portfolio companies could look like, what their activities are, what specific issues they're addressing. I would like to now shift the focus a bit on the investor side, on those who are actually active in providing financial means to address this topic. And while we take a bit of a dive into this topic, I would also like to know from the audience in our next poll question to what extent they consider WASH when making investment decisions. So is this part of your investment portfolio? Is this something that you're looking at? And from you, Paul, I would like to hear a bit more about are there typical investment vehicles that address WASH investment? Is there a specific structure, or how does this look like when you look to invest into WASH, or what do you need to look out for when you're trying to invest into WASH as an investment topic?
Sure. Well, while everyone's pondering the options there, something that's worth stating, if it's not clear already from what we've been saying, is of course that the question of access to water and sanitation, this is something that is of course overwhelmingly a problem in the developing world, not the developed world. So obviously that has an influence on the kind of investors and the kind of expertise you need when it comes to investing in this space. Now, after that, of course, the clue is in the title of this webinar. Typically, it's the investors that have been most active in this space and the products that have been most active in this space and successful have been blended products. After that, there are different types of structure that will reach to it. I mean, to give one example, we actually, there are funds out there that invest in this space, but to give one example, we recently issued a bond that was investing in this space among several other spaces as well. And that bond benefited from a partial guarantee from SIDA, the Swedish Development Agency, but also from institutional investors, from pension funds that were willing to put in their part of the private investment. It is, however, nonetheless a topic where you really do need an infrastructure of investment professionals in the various markets where you're looking to operate, and a certain degree of expertise when it comes to the developing world.
So you also need to have a group of people who have the appetite for these kind of investments, not only just the focus. We've just gotten the results from the poll. Thank you very much for that. I'm very happy and I would say positively surprised to see that we have no answers that don't consider WASH or any other thematic themes for their investment decisions. We have quite a large group who is looking at thematic components or have thematic components as an integral part of their investments. And hopefully after this webinar, if they haven't considered it, they will also take a look at certain WASH components in their investments. How do you see these results from the audience poll?
Like you, I'm positively surprised. I guess they may consider thematic components, but not WASH. I guess maybe perhaps our audience is a little bit, if they're logging into this webinar, it's hopefully because they're already interested by impact investing in any case. But I would guess that it also reflects the fact that this is a topic that everyone recognizes as being very important from a sustainability perspective, albeit it doesn't get quite the same degree of focus as maybe some of the other more obvious topics in impact investing.
Certainly, and I hope that as this topic continues to develop and with it also the different investment opportunities, that the group that currently doesn't necessarily considers can be convinced to move one notch up and also include it in their decisions. We are already coming towards the end of this session. Paul, maybe in 3 sentences, could you wrap up what the key takeaway for our audience are from what we've been discussing today?
Sure, well, I'll try and make it short to give a bit of space to questions. Look, WASH is a topic that is critical when it comes to development in terms of improving quality of life, but in terms of also long-term economic and social benefits. The second thing I would say is that there are companies out there that can contribute to improving access to water and sanitation in a tangible, meaningful way. And the third point is to say, look, the job of impact investors and the products that are out there is to bring together investors who are motivated by this, and according to the poll, there are many of them, with those companies, and ultimately help the end beneficiaries of those companies.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for joining. With that, I would like to close our session and open the platform for questions and answers.
All right. First question, and this one is for you, Samuel. Is there a difference in return when considering WASH investments?
I think it's a very good question, and I think this also goes into the context of the broader questions that we get on a regular basis when it comes to sustainable investing. I think it's exactly the point that there is not really a difference in return, meaning also that investors don't lose, let's say, return for doing sustainable investing. So I think you have you are working in an environment that has a more specific focus addressing a more specific universe of investees. And I think there's also a sort of a long-term component from a sustainability aspect where you are addressing certain issues that could also generate costs to society or to the group of investors in the future that are currently not accounted for.
Perfect. And Paul, this is for you. Can you clarify how blended finance made WASH investments possible? This wasn't clear to me.
Well, then that's my fault, I should say. The answer to that is the following. I think despite what Sam was saying with regard to returns, there is a reality that there are, of course, some investors who might be a little bit reluctant to invest in, certainly in developing world, and who wouldn't necessarily think that this is automatically a space or an area that they would go into. The effect of having, in this instance, the Swedish Development Agency providing a guarantee on part of the portfolio, obviously that improves the economics of the product. And of course, it's a signal to the market. It says to the market, look, this is an area that is a priority for us, but also which we feel is one that's, that is viable, that is financially sustainable. So in that respect, it's the combination of the two is really something that enabled us to have the impact that we wanted to have.
Perfect. All right, another one for you, Paul. WASH projects have a very important positive impact on health and hence labor productivity. Can you comment on this, Paul?
Well, I can't claim to be an absolute expert in that, but I think it's clear that, for example, as we mentioned before, there is the element of, yes, if you have a significant, I mean, if we think back to our own history, and the extent to which diseases such as cholera used to have a huge impact on urban populations, say in the UK during the industrial era, before we had proper sanitation. That's clearly a signal that if that is still ongoing today, if in 2022 there are still significant parts of the population that at any given moment can be laid low, then of course that's going to have an influence on A, their ability to attend school and get an education, B, their ability to regularly attend work and maintain employment, and C, of course, that's going to have an impact on the health system and indeed the fiscal stability of an entire country. So all of these things play a part in a country's ability to develop from an economic perspective. So this isn't just, you're right to say it's not just a quality of life question.
And another to you, Paul. Loans to consumers to improve sanitation are non-productive loans and more risky vis-a-vis productive microfinance loans. How does blended finance mitigate this high risk?
Well, obviously, at the same time, you still need to carry out a detailed degree of underwriting to make sure that this is a loan that's that is repayable. And that, I mean, that goes for any micro loan. There should be underwriting standards in place to ensure that this is the case. Now, the effects, as we mentioned before, are going to be indirect at best, in the sense that it is something that is going to improve quality of life and health outcomes, but it's not something where you can have to draw the direct line in the same way that you can with the productive loan. So in the case of a blended finance product, I wouldn't say it's necessarily so much about the blended finance product itself. It's more about ensuring that having the ESG standards in place that ensure that underwriting standards are stringent, and that ultimately this loan is being made to a borrower that can actually afford to have, that can afford to take it out.
Perfect. And then Samuel, over to you. Would you please elaborate on the MNG acquisition, which happened officially yesterday for anyone who doesn't know, and how it affect responsAbility in the coming years?
Yeah, sure. It's been one that's been popping up on a regular basis, but I think first of all is to say that we're as responsAbility are very excited about this this next chapter that we're moving in. From a company perspective, there won't be any changes in the sense that our fund structures and our management and so on will continue to be the same. We are, however, looking at certain synergies and certain additions that will hopefully, or we're expecting to be benefiting from the MNG structure, given this is a large asset manager and also an asset owner that will help us when we drive innovation, when we drive new product developments. And they also have a relatively big distribution network outside of Switzerland that we're expecting to be benefiting from. So we see it as a big opportunity for responsAbility. So strengthening our growth and our expansion while maintaining our current offering and our current product line here in Switzerland and where we've already been present.
Perfect. All right, next, Paul, does responsAbility have plans to issue another social bond also aimed at the WASH sector?
I mean, at this point, what I said about building up capacity in rural areas and everything, I mean, that cuts in many ways. And one of those is, of course, we as an organization, the social bond is the social bond that we issued has been a tremendous opportunity for us to develop our own kind of learnings in-house with regard to this topic. So I certainly wouldn't rule it out. But obviously I can't really comment much further than that. But I think in general, this is a topic where we've gained a certain amount of additional expertise now, and one where the impact benefits are very clear.
And another one in that line, Paul, how do you avoid green and impact washing when investing in WASH? No pun intended.
Yeah, no pun intended. Yeah. No, it's a good question. I mean, first of all, as you've heard me talk the talk in terms of, well, you establish an impact thesis, you invest in a certain way. We also talked a bit about making sure we pick the right metrics. So it really is trying to focus on these questions on things like accessibility, on affordability. It is about trying to really look at these organizations in detail and trying to make sure that they really are actually tangibly having an effect on, making a positive contribution to resolving some of these problems. I would argue that in some respects, for this sector in particular, it's once you've established those basic elements of affordability and accessibility, it's relatively easy to do that. It's pretty clear already. I mean, when we've looked at companies like Rian and Jibu, their impact is very clear to see, and the business model and the rationale for it is very clear to see. So once you can establish that, look, they are reaching this many millions of people with a product or a service that is demonstrably available to low-income households, after that, it's something that's relatively easy to establish. But I do understand that in general, people always have this concern when it comes to impact washing. You heard my dancing metaphor earlier, so it's making sure that we're the ones who are the good dancers.
All right. I have some very specific questions here to finish with. So Paul, do you consider larger infrastructure projects in sanitation and water, such as financing the building of wastewater treatment plants, as part of responsAbility's WASH investment universe?
Thus far, we haven't. I think it wasn't as obviously within the remit of the social bond. It's also something where those kind of larger projects, obviously, they're often in conjunction with local governments, which themselves bring their own series of complications, and they can be very long and protracted transactions to put in place. Also, from a purely pragmatic perspective, those larger projects around sanitation and wastewater, wastewater treatment, the degree of ESG standards that you need to establish and the degree of ESG analysis that you need to do to ensure that there are no negative effects and nothing bad is being done is extremely high. So that's the kind of analysis that it can take a very long time, and it can be very, very complex. So from our perspective, just from purely pragmatic perspective, it makes more sense to aim a little bit smaller, but I wouldn't rule anything out in the future.
All right, and finally, and I don't know if you can answer this one or not, but let's go for it. For MFIs, is collateral required for WASH loan or lending against cash flow, an audited report?
Oh, I honestly don't know.
Yeah. We need that for, that's for our
End with
investment
winter
teams. Sorry.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
All right. Well, then on that note, thank you everyone for attending. Follow us on LinkedIn. You'll always find our webinars there, and wishing everyone a lovely day, whatever time of day it is for you.
See you next time. Bye-bye.
Ciao.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.